Caleb, thanks for being on the program. I got to say, I really enjoyed your book. Not only was it well written and well researched, but I'm a big fan of Capitol Hill Baptist Church and Mark Dever and the work that happens there. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Yeah, and I'm going to say Capitol Hill Baptist Church throughout, probably, but the church began as Metropolitan Baptist Church, and I want to ask you a little bit about kind of the beginning stages. Let's just stipulate for the record that we're not going to be able to go into great detail on your fantastic book, but that what that means is if you like what you hear, go get the book, go read the book. But let me begin with kind of a big picture why question. Why write this history? Why now? Why did you feel like that this moment was the right moment to write this history?
Yeah, I think we're at a time when there's a lot of interest in faith. We're seeing a growth in Bible sales are off the charts, and yet there's also some disillusionment with the local church. I think people look at celebrity churches or pastors, they look at mega churches sometimes with some distrust, and sometimes think that faith means following Jesus all on your own. What I love about this book and even this genre of writing a biography of a local church is you see the corporate nature of the Christian life, that it's meant to be lived in the context of a community, and really that your investment in a local church might be the most important thing you do with your life.
This church, as I mentioned a little bit ago, began as Metropolitan Baptist Church, and it began I don't know if it's fair to say this, Caleb, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It began really not as a church, but as a Bible study or kind of a Sunday school class, even. Can you tell me who Celestia Ferris is and why she's so instrumental to this story, especially the early part of this story?
Yeah, the story of Capitol Hill Baptist Church begins with a woman named Celestia Ferris. She was born in upstate New York in 1844 and moved to DC with her family. And as she was growing up, the nation was falling apart. She was in DC during the tumultuous days of the Civil War. She experienced her church, her local Baptist church, split over the war, people taking different sides. And as she grew up and married, and before even having children of her own, she and her husband moved to a new part of DC where there was no local church, no Baptist church, no Presbyterian church, just no church of any denomination in this area, which today is known as Capitol Hill. It's just the region immediately to the east of the Capitol building. And they started praying. They called their friends together in 1867 to pray for a church to be started on Capitol Hill. And the way they got that church started might sound a little unconventional to modern ears. They started by beginning with a Sunday school. They thought the way to reach families and evangelize the unreached was to reach the children of the next generation. And so after praying for 4 years, they started a Sunday school. They then bought a plot of land and built a chapel where they began hosting services on Sunday nights eventually. And 11 years after that initial prayer meeting in 1867, in 1878, 31 people came together to covenant to form a local church on Capitol Hill.
One of the another sort of anecdote from that early part of the history of the church really captured my imagination. And I think it captured my imagination because, and again, Caleb, correct me if I'm wrong, it sort of illustrates a theme of the book. And one of the themes I think of your book, I don't know if you intended this or not, was that it's not always kind of the well-known celebrities that were instrumental in the story of the church. But sometimes it's the story of people like Celestia Ferris, a woman who started a prayer meeting and then started a Sunday school. But another part of that story from that era was when a bunch of children got together to gather bricks to build the first building. Can you briefly tell that story? Because I just found it fascinating and an example of just how the sort of unknown, unheralded people were really instrumental in the story.
Yeah, really yeah, you're exactly right. The sub theme of the book is how God works through ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. And so at one point in these early days, 1874, Celestia Ferris tells her Sunday school kids, hey, on your way to Sunday school, if you see a spare brick lying on the street, especially if it's in good shape, why don't you just bring it with you? We're going to start constructing a building. And so the kids are going about bringing bricks, but two little girls, they go by a brickyard And they ask the brickyard owner if he has any spare bricks. And he asks them, well, what do you need these bricks for? And they say, well, our Sunday school teacher told us to collect bricks because we're building a church. And he said, oh, I'll tell you what I'll do. And he sends a whole cart full of bricks. And the girls were so encouraged by his generosity that they proceed to go to a second brickyard. And they tell the second brickyard owner what the first brickyard owner did. And he matches their gift. He sends a second brickload. So the whole front of the building, our records say, the whole front of the building was completed through these donated bricks from these two brickyard owners. It just shows, again, the Lord loves to use unexpected and ordinary people, even children, to accomplish extraordinary things.
Well, I want to fast forward just a little bit in our story because, as I said, we can't really cover the entire story. But from 1875-ish, which is, the story of the acquisition of the land and the building of that first church, to more towards the end of the century. Green Clay Smith was a pastor of that church for a few years until he died in 1895. But in some ways, his pastorate, even though, 20 years have passed and there have been other pastors, in some ways, his pastorate, which was only a few years right before he died, was kind of a defining moment. Can you tell me who he was and why attracting him as the pastor was such an important moment in the life of the church?
Absolutely. So Green Clay Smith, who is not well known today, but he would have been much closer to a household name in his day. He was a member of the famous Clay family of Kentucky. He's the nephew of Cassius Clay, and not the boxer who we know today is Muhammad Ali, but Cassius Clay, again, a member of the Clay family, very famous for his involvement in the Civil War. He, again, Green Clay Smith kind of had this larger than life background. He married the niece of the famous Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court. So again, very prominent family. He goes on to serve as a brigadier general during the Civil War. He serves as a congressman. He's appointed territorial governor of Montana. There was even rumors that he was going to be on the ticket as Lincoln's vice president. That didn't end up working out. But at some point in his life, at some point while he's in Kentucky, Green Clay Smith seems to be both converted and called to ministry. And so he comes back home to Kentucky and announces to his family, to their great horror, that he has become a Baptist pastor, that he's intending to become a pastor. And he doesn't just go on to pastor prominent churches. He pastors dozens of churches around Kentucky, including some as few as starting, a church with just 7 members. He ends up pastoring a prominent church in Frankfort where the governor is a member. So he's kind of all over the map in Kentucky, but his final pastorate is in Washington, D.C. Something drew him back, maybe to where his career had gotten started. Maybe he wanted to do some good in the capital. It's hard to say, but in 1890, Green Clay Smith comes to Washington, D.C. to be the pastor of Metropolitan Baptist Church. And he's really a real mover and shaker. He's a great preacher. He's beloved by the congregation. He certainly puts the church on the map, so to speak. Under his pastorate, it's not uncommon for Supreme Court justices to walk just 3 blocks over and give a lecture at the church and so forth. But as you mentioned, he dies as pastor in June of 1895, but really had grown the church both in its financial stability, its prominence, but also its commitment as a leading evangelical church in the nation's capital.
Well, let's say a little bit more about that theme, because that is another theme of the book. It seems to me, Caleb, is that Capitol Hill Baptist Church, or Metropolitan Baptist Church, almost from the very beginning, saw itself as the church on a hill for the city on a hill. I mean that, if America was this shining light, this great experiment, and for the world, really. And Washington was the center of that vision, that dream, that ideal. Then Capitol Hill Baptist Church was going to be the spiritual center for that. They were going to, and that idea not was there from the beginning, but it seems to me that under Green Clay Smith that it really came to fruition, that didn't seem like merely an aspiration or hubris, but something that was beginning to become reality. Do I have that right?
I think so. And it's hard to know how much the church just fell into this position, just as the one of the churches in closest proximity to the Capitol building, and because of the number of members who were involved in civil government or working in politics. And yet this is a tension in the church's history. To what extent is it just an ordinary local church where the most important things are happening are the ordinary means of grace, the preaching of the word, the Lord's Supper, the baptism, just the things that make it a normal church. That's the most important part of it. And to what extent is does it have a significant mission in the nation's capital, next to the Capitol building, kind of heralding the word of life and at times calling the nation to repentance, calling the country to repentance. I think the church has both served as a thermostat and a thermometer.
Mm.
The state of the church has both indicated something of the spiritual health of the nation. It's also, I think, played some part in influencing the spiritual temperature of the nation. And I think the book reflects both of those themes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about other people, but one more person I want to talk about before I step back from the church itself and maybe look at some of those things a little bit more. But one is John Compton Ball. As near as my simple rudimentary math, Caleb, says that he pastored that church longer than any other person, as near as I can tell. It was
That's
over
right.
40 years from about 1903. So, so Smith died in 1895. Some transition there, but in 1903 he came along and pastored all the way almost completely through World War II, through World War One, through the Spanish flu, through the Great Depression, through World War II. Tell me a little bit about him and his character and what happened at the church during his 40 plus year tenure as pastor there.
Yeah, a remarkable figure, pastor for 41 years. He's responsible for building the current building. He's responsible for really growing the church as an evangelical powerhouse in the first half of the 20th century. He's responsible for, I think, holding fast to biblical orthodoxy. And yet, by the time of his retirement, uh, it doesn't seem clear that he's left the church in a particularly healthy place spiritually. So he's a complex character. I think it's hard to understand everything going on with him, and yet we're grateful that for his stability. And one thing that I often note to people is that he pastored the church during some of the greatest transitions in our national history: World War One, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, World War II, into New Deal era. So it's a remarkable pastorate, and he preached the gospel the whole time. And he was trained at a seminary, Crozier, same school that Martin Luther King Jr. would end up going to. He's trained by a faculty that is still conservative and affirms biblical authority. If he had been trained at that seminary just 20 years or 30 years later, 40 years later, he would not have had that same theological grounding. And it is a mercy that at this critical time, we have longevity in our pastor, 41 years. Instead of having to call a new pastor when the debates over fundamentalism and modernism are going on, we enjoy a strong degree of stability as a church.
Capitol Hill Baptist Church, Metropolitan Baptist Churches, rep, history on race relations is not perfect
Yeah,
by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the things it seems to me that happened under John Compton Ball was that there was some effort to reach out in across the what were then true racial barriers. In fact, my recollection is that you have a picture in your book of Ball on his retirement,
that's right.
that there's a black pastor sitting with him, and they ended up shaking hands. And that may not sound like much today, but in its era, it was something really significant, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So the pastor he's there with is Walter Henderson Brooks, the longtime pastor of 19th Street Baptist Church. He pastored that church for I think 71 years.
Wow.
Brooks is an amazing pastor, very gifted preacher, poet, statesman, Baptist leader, and yeah, it is significant that they had a friendship, a relationship, pastoral camaraderie, and that Brooks was present there at John Compton Ball's retirement in 1944 when, everyday things like, an opera or going to a show, all those things would have been heavily segregated. And yet it's important that Paul sent a message saying that the gospel does not divide along color line.
One of the things that I was fascinated by in your book, Caleb, was a description of some of the various revivals that took place in Washington, D.C., and the role that Capitol Hill Baptist Church, Metropolitan Baptist Church, Capitol Hill Baptist Church played within those revivals. And again, we're not going to process all of those, but Billy Sunday was holding revivals in the early part of the 20th century. By mid-century, Billy Graham was holding revivals, and Capitol Hill Baptist Church was an important part of some of the Billy Graham revivals. But there's one in those the participation in those revivals, leadership of some of those revivals really played a role in the growth of the church at various times in the history of the church. But there's one revivalist that I want you to say more about, but just in part because I've never heard of her before. And if I'd never heard of her, and I kind of think I'm paying attention to this kind of stuff, I think others might not either. And that is Amy Lee Stockton. Who was Amy Lee Stockton? And why was she such a beloved figure for a number of years at Capitol Hill Baptist Church?
Yeah, this was the biggest surprise in my research. People ask me, what was the biggest surprise you found? And without a doubt, it is Amy Lee Stockton. So Amy Lee Stockton was born in 1892. She came of age kind of during the flapper era, like 1920s and 30s, and she quickly emerged on the scene as a leading female evangelist and revivalist preacher. And so she featured largely in national evangelistic campaigns up and down the West Coast, the East Coast in the 20s and 30s, including preaching a number of times here at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And again, when I first saw this, I almost fell out of my chair because I was looking at a bulletin, just going through church bulletins, and I see, 1926 or 28, whatever the year is, morning preacher, Amy Lee Stockton.
Well, and let me hit the pause button, Caleb, because you and I know, but some of our listeners may not know that your current pastor, Mark Dever, and the leadership of your church, are very firmly in the complementarian camp.
That's right.
And the idea that a female preacher would actually be in the pulpit at your church on a Sunday morning would probably be a little bit of a shock to some of your current members. Is that
It
fair?
would ruffle some feathers,
Yeah.
for sure. And yet, part of the story I'm trying to tell is in history, you're always looking for complexity and to complexify matters and to show that the past is often more complex than we'd like to understand. So here you have a leading fundamentalist church. This church was early involved in the commitment to the authority, the inerrancy of Scripture, firmly holding all the fundamentals of the faith, and involved at a national level in organizing efforts and fighting for fidelity within denominational life. And at least at that time, that seems to have apparently been consistent with, on occasion, having at least one female evangelist fairly regularly in the pulpit. I think I counted 11, 12, or 13 times I found her teaching to the church. And it wasn't just to women and children, though it included that, but it also included preaching. In fact, I found one reference when the pastor took an extended vacation for 6 weeks. The church voted that Miss Stockton be called to fill the pulpit in his absence. I think today there are many who would claim to fit under the complementarian banner who are fine with a woman preaching in the pulpit as long as it's under the authority of the elders. It seems to be that was the kind of practice. But I think what it goes to show is that this had not yet emerged as a dividing line within the evangelical or within the broader fundamentalist camp. And part of the reason is it takes some time for the implications of different ideas to be sought out. I don't think that her preaching was rooted in a hermeneutic of Scripture that tended toward a denial of basic truths of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And yet, it certainly showed that this was something that had not yet been resolved at that time.
Yeah. Well, and it was also interesting to me that as near as I could tell from reading your book, and again, I'd never really encountered this woman until your book, Caleb, is that she was a beloved figure. I mean, that she was just truly loved by the membership of the church and by the leadership of the church as well.
Yeah, if you want to read more, but the only like extensive treatment I found of her was a history of the origins of Baptist fundamentalism by Kevin Bowder and Robert Delnay. They did a good job in a book on her from 2014, just a section. Otherwise, I found virtually no work done on her.
Well,
Remarkable.
that's helpful guidance. So thank you for that. Now, Caleb, obviously, and I've already said this a couple of times, so I'm not going to. I'm belaboring the point at this point to say we've got to leave out a whole lot. I mean,
Yep.
we've just covered pretty close to 125, 135 years just in the 20 minutes. But I'm gonna fast forward here and come to your current pastor, Mark Dever. I mean, I don't know Mark well. We've met a few times. We've had a meal or two together, um, and I've read, of course, his books. Probably a lot of our listeners know his books and know Capitol Hill Baptist Church through him and through the Nine Marks of Ministry and so on and so forth. But when he took over the church, um, it was not in really that great a shape, and B, he was not on a path to become a local church pastor. I mean, this was a huge pivot for both the church and for him. Can you take us back to that moment when Mark first became the pastor of the church? What was he doing? What was the church doing?
Yeah, the Mark was installed here as pastor in 1994. Uh, prior to being here, he had finished a PhD in church history at the University of Cambridge in England. He was an associate pastor of a church there in Cambridge, and he was serving as a tutor at the college. He was teaching history. He was overseeing undergraduates. He was helping doctoral students, and his plan was really to be a professor. He had considered many different vocations in his life. Pastor had always been there on the back of his mind. He had planted a church while a student at Gordon Conwell in Topsfield, Massachusetts. But it was Carl Henry, a longtime member here at the church, and some of the listeners may be familiar with him, the founding editor of Christianity Today, a leading theologian. Carl Henry wrote to Mark and said, "Hey, something's happened. Our pastor has disqualified himself morally. The church is really struggling. We don't really know what's next. We need to call someone new. Would you be willing to consider this opportunity? Would you come here and preach?" And really, as a favor to Carl, who he had known from days at Southern Seminary, and Carl had been a mentor of sorts in Mark's life. Mark came here and he preached, and it was his experience visiting the church, seeing the need, seeing the opportunity. I think meeting some of the members, seeing God's faithfulness, both in history and even to that present point, and the suffering that they were going through. He felt compelled that this is what the Lord wanted him to do with his life. And remarkably, he didn't immediately tell his wife how he felt. He just asked her when he got back. She asked him how the trip was, and she said, "I think we should consider this." She said it before he did. She hadn't even been there. He said, "Well, why don't you go there, see what your experience is?" He just knew if this is the Lord, it'll happen. But it'll take some convincing if we're going to go do this.
Yeah.
And so she came here as well. And remarkably, it was actually during a prayer meeting of the church. I remember the church began with prayer. It was during a prayer meeting that as she listened to an elderly woman in the church pray, Connie, Mark's wife, became convinced this is where the Lord is leading us. And so their ministry here has been marked by great fruitfulness. Um, None of that is attributed to the skill set of one man alone. He came and did ordinary things, preaching the word, practicing faithful membership, um, pushing through in hard seasons, and the Lord has blessed the work. And we're very grateful for what the Lord's done.
Yeah, in fact, I was found it somewhat humorous because I mean, first of all, I really enjoy Mark's preaching and teaching, but I did find it humorous that whenever he first came, there were people you quoted in your book who said he's a great guy, solid in every way, has the potential to be a good preacher, but not really a great preacher today. And I found that both humorous and an example of what you were just talking about. I mean, it was just kind of everyday faithfulness and showing up and doing your job and, being faithful to God day in and day out, year in and year out, which has been a hallmark of Mark's ministry. Do I have that right?
And that's exactly right. And the Lord's really grown him as a preacher.
Oh
But
yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know. I never
certainly,
heard him back in those days, but yeah.
certainly the ordinary means of grace. And yeah, in fact, I mean, most of the mentors in his life told him you're meant for academia. You are not meant to be a local church pastor. And yet there you go.
Well, let me since we're up more or less to the present, I want to hit a couple of themes here that, or maybe introduce a couple of quick ideas to close us with. One of the things that's been interesting about Capitol Hill Baptist and Mark Dever's leadership there is that, we talked in the early days about Capitol Hill being a mega church, which technically means, more than 2,000 people in regular attendance on a Sunday morning. And Capitol Hill Baptist Church has certainly been a mega church in its history. But one of the things that typifies Capitol Hill Baptist Church today is that it doesn't aspire to be a megachurch. I couldn't tell you exactly how many people show up for church on a Sunday morning, but I don't think it's 2,000. I think it may be somewhat less than that. And every time there's been an opportunity, maybe to acquire real estate or to maybe move out into the suburbs or to, have a bigger footprint, the church under Mark's leadership has chosen not to do that. They've chosen instead to raise up pastoral interns who would plant churches. Many of them planted in the nearby area. In fact, I mentioned to you, Caleb, and earlier in our conversation that I met Mark. I've met Mark a few times, and one time I had lunch with him and Garrett Kell, who at that time was one of the interns. You mentioned Garrett in your book, and and during lunch, I said, Mark mentioned that Garrett was going to be preaching, and then he was going to very soon plant a church or revitalize a church, I think was the case. And I said, Mark, aren't you afraid that Garrett is going to take some of your members away from you whenever he, goes out to revitalize this church? And Mark said, no, I'm not afraid. I'm praying that will happen. And that to me just seems so refreshing and different from the posture and philosophy of a lot of senior pastors of big churches. Can you say more about that strategy for growth that Capitol Hill has been pursuing for at least the last 30 years?
Yeah, we want the gospel to not be dependent on one church or one man. We think that there's a theological and spiritual famine going on, and we want as many people to be as fed as possible. And, we're committed to one service, one assembly. We think the church is a gathering. And when you take that conviction, one assembly, one gathering, and you are experiencing growth and everyone doesn't fit, the only option is to plant. And over the course of the recent history, the last 30 years, we've reached that point many times. And the philosophy has just been to raise up, train up men, send them out to church plant or revitalize in the surrounding area. And by God's grace, that's happened time and time again. And we've learned a lot in the process. Now those churches are planting other churches that are flourishing, and we're seeing a spiritual fruitfulness in the area. And we think that's the best thing for the kingdom. And
well, Caleb, can you give me, and you may not know this off the top of your head because you wrote a book of history and not necessarily current events, but you are a pastor there now, so maybe you might know this. Do you know how many churches Capitol Hill Baptist has planted, in this era of church planting that it's in now?
it depends on
15, 20, 25?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you're counting. I mean, because we'll send out, planting, right? That's technically starting from scratch. Revitalizing it might be that the church is in more dire straits. But then what's the difference between revitalizing and, planting and just sending out a pastor to pastor a fairly healthy church locally? I'd just say we've probably trained up and sent out 20 pastors to area churches. And some of that is through the way we do our staffing. We hire assistant pastors like myself to be here for a few years to get experience preaching and teaching and leading, and with the idea of going out to pastor somewhere else. And then we use the internship program as well. And so the philosophy is, and the church is very generous to bring pastors in for a while and then to send them out.
Yeah. Well, Caleb, that's an amazing story. And you've written a remarkable book that does that story justice, A Light on the Hill. I'm grateful for the book, grateful for your time today. Any final thought or closing idea? Maybe something that we've mentioned that you want to reiterate, or a new idea that I'm just not smart enough to have gotten to.
No, I want to drive home the point that God does extraordinary things through ordinary people and ordinary churches. And part of the most important thing we can do in our life is to help pass the torch of the gospel from one generation to the next. And that looks like, among other things, investing in your local church. It may seem insignificant to show up to that meeting. It may seem insignificant to prepare that next sermon, but you are part of passing on the torch to the next generation. And God does extraordinary things through that.
It's a good word. Caleb, thank you so much.
Thank you, Warren.